Hamish de Bretton-Gordon is director at DBG Defence. He is a senior executive with the military, humanitarian, charity, and commercial experience. Hamish is also a world-leading authority on chemical weapons and humanitarian support in Syria, and is a vocal advocate for a Ukrainian victory. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like the video if once you watch it you think it's useful and high value material. Please do also subscribe, share it around your network of contacts. It's absolutely critical in this election year that people hear strong voices like Hamish's when there are so many, I would say, weak voices in the media and politics who are not advocating for a Ukrainian victory. It will also help people to discover the fantastic speakers on the channel. Please also do check out the validated Ukrainian charities that appear in the description of the video. It is incredibly important at this time to help Ukraine remain resilient. Hamish, I'm delighted to welcome you to the channel. I should mention as well, you also have a book if people are interested in, and we will pop details of that book in the description of the video.
Well, thanks very much for having me.
You do a lot of these interviews, and of course that is what prompted me to get in touch. You've got a very strong, I think, and clear-sighted view on what needs to happen to ensure not just Ukrainian victory, but explicitly a Russian defeat. And you wrote, I think, an absolutely compelling assessment in the paper recently. And this is I've heard this from a number of people, including those who are on the ground in Ukraine. But you've said NATO might only have 4 months left to actually swing the needle towards a Ukrainian victory and help it prevail. What led you to this pessimistic assessment, and what chance do you think we have of actually using those 4 months to turn this around?
Well, I think there are a number of things here. The most compelling is the US elections in November. And at the moment, it seems likely that Trump is going to be the next president, and his vice president is Vance. Now, both of these have been very strong advocates of reducing US military support to Ukraine. And really, since the get-go, it is the weight of and the type of US military support that has been the most important factor in Ukraine holding back the Russians. Now, without that support, and everybody I'm sure is aware the $60 billion worth that was signed off a few months ago, which is now rolling in, Ukraine will be in a very difficult position. Now, I agree with Trump on virtually nothing, but I do agree when he says that Europe needs to spend more on its defense and do more to help Ukraine. Now, the balance will be is whether the European countries, including the UK, can fill the delta left if the US does do what Trump and Vance are going to say. And that could be a huge challenge. So I think to galvanize everybody, that is where the 4 months come from up to November. And also it's at a time when, we just had an election in this country and there is a lot of focus on defense. And I and others firmly believe that actually one of the key reasons that Putin invaded on the 24th of February 2022 is he looked west and he didn't see a conventional deterrence. And although the UK is only one of a number of European NATO countries, we are one of the leading ones, and our conventional defense has been denuded sort of very, very significantly since then. It's also a time when many other global events are happening that could have an impact on Ukraine. But being slightly more positive, I think it's also a time where actually things are starting to move towards positive for Ukraine. Now, one of the key elements in any ground warfare is their superiority, which Russia has pretty much had for the whole of the war, which has meant that ground maneuver of Ukrainian forces has been incredibly difficult. But this is beginning to change, and the balance of sort of air defense assets, the balance of drones, and also the highly sophisticated and highly capable Western long-range precision missiles like the UK Storm Shadow are actually coming in numbers and having effect. And some countries like the UK are now giving sort of taking the shackles off Ukraine on the use of some of these strategic weapons that are having a real impact in the sort of depth areas of Russia where the war is supported from. We're also aware that the F-16s, the American fighter jets, are literally, we understand some are already in country. And again, this could tip the balance in the air power war. We know the Ukrainian maritime capability, I hardly say Navy, has already defeated the Black Sea Fleet, so they have freedom of maneuver in the Black Sea, and Crimea is looking vulnerable. So there are an awful lot of things that might well happen over the next 4 months that will put Ukraine on the front foot. But I think we need to be hugely aware that if Trump does become president and pulls the plug, we are in a very different situation. I think just finally on this one, all of us who look at this deeply and have a reasonable understanding of the Russians don't think that Putin will stop in Ukraine if he prevails. And that is an argument that I think a lot of people are finding difficult to grasp. Particularly here, I've just been speaking on Irish radio, and they're even further west than us, and they find all this quite incongruous. So that's where the 4 months comes from, and that is why I think we in this country and other European NATO countries really need to take up the heavy lifting, and also be aware that the Americans might sort of reduce their support from November onwards.
Well, I definitely want to pick up on that military spending aspect, and of course the multi-front hybrid aggression which we face, not only in the context of the Ukraine war, but even if there was to be a peace there, it is perhaps fanciful that a multi-front hybrid aggression would actually end. In fact, it may intensify, but we'll come to that later. You mentioned shackles and you mentioned F-16s. It is, however, notable, isn't it, that the F-16s that are being provided are all coming from European allies. None of them are earmarked from US stocks. There seems to be a definite hesitation on the side of the US in striking too hard against Russia. Again, we'll perhaps come back to that, because if we want to be uncharitable, it seems that the US policy is to fight harder for keeping the status quo rather than ensuring Russian defeat, which will probably mean some kind of collapse of the current regime. But this idea of shackles is critical, because when those shackles are partially lifted, Ukraine was able to strike back north of Kharkiv, and now the process of the absolute destruction of that city has been checked for a period, and the feared invasion of Sumy has potentially been disrupted through these changes of policy. So this is fantastic. It shows that Ukraine can use these weapons, and that's incredibly important. They're unshackled, and yet they are still prevented from striking Russian air bases that launch Shaheeds, missiles, etc., based on the 100-kilometer exclusion within Russia. From your military experience, and I've spoken to several people, including to William Sheriff and others, they say it's absolutely nonsensical from a military point of view. Would you agree that the shackles that remain need to be lifted and that they are nonsensical?
I would agree they're nonsensical, because in effect, Russia has no shackles on it. It is attacking all sorts of targets in Ukraine, and many of them are war crimes. We had the hospital in Kyiv hit a couple of weeks ago, which I saw a lot of the Russians in Syria at close hand, and it was a classic thing. If you kill enough civilians and destroy enough hospitals and schools, the civilian population capitulates, and the Russians are trying to do the same. So the fact that Ukraine can't strike into Russia to hit its airfields and its supply lines is ridiculous, because that's exactly what Russia is doing in Ukraine. I think also your point about American hardware support. I mean, the US and the UK and other European countries have been so slow to get aboard the capabilities. It was first of all air defense weapons. It was then tanks, and when the Americans gave 31 Abrams tanks, but took all the special armor off them, so not unsurprisingly, they all got slotted. But there are thousands of Abrams tanks in Europe, which would make a real difference. Same with the UK. We gave 14 Challenger 2s. I mean, in their own, they're far more capable than a Russian tank, but it's all about mass. One one lion will kill one hyena, but a pack of hyenas will kill one lion, sort of thing. So I think this whole mass and providing capability, we're all been so late to the day. But it goes back to your point that, America, I think the war in Ukraine looks very different from Washington and probably the West or the East Coast of the United States. And, with isolationists like Trump and Vance potentially about to take over, that could even become even worse. So, what one slightly understands what the US is looking at there. But I think what we need to learn rapidly, and we're learning from a military perspective, certainly at the tactical level, we're learning an awful lot. And the new government announcing a defence review is timely, although Chief of the General Staff, Sir Rollo Walker, speaking at RUSI yesterday, would suggest we haven't got the sort of time that the new government thinks that we've got. But when it comes back to Ukraine itself, if Ukraine is unshackled and can take out those airfields, which are well within range of Storm Shadow and ATACMS, then that will have a severe effect on the Russian ability to continue strikes into Ukraine. And I think the key thing is, if we don't enable Ukraine to prevail, the next stage is very much sort of NATO boots on the ground to support them. I, for one, cannot understand why NATO is not taking out Russian missiles and drones aimed at civilian targets in Ukraine. After all, when Iran fired over 300 missiles and targets at Israeli civilians, the UK led with the States and took them all out. So it's there is a bit of a reality check here, and I hope that the new government don't take too long to get aboard it. My concern with 14 years out of power that might be the case, but absolutely we need to enable Ukraine militarily to finish the job, and by putting unrealistic sort of handcuffs on them will prolong this war, create more casualties in Ukraine. So, we need to bite that pill now and allow them to get on with it. Otherwise, we might have to become more directly involved ourselves in the future.
Well, we'll tackle the almost unthinkable idea of what would happen if Russia actually scored a partial or full victory. But you mention certainly the rhetoric that's come out of Trump in his last administration and in the current campaign, which is that Europe isn't pulling its weight. And that can be applied to many countries, unfortunately. There's an element of truth there. But some, like Poland, are certainly arming up. They're far closer to the problem, and they have been part of the Russian imperial sort of dominance for a high degree of time, including the post-war period. Their GDP spending on defense is, I think from the last figures, is approaching 3.8%. And I think the Baltics are also, nudging up and giving considerable quantities to Ukraine, despite their size. At the moment, we're still talking about 2.5%. There is the defense review that's taking place. You've written that the right kind of noises are being made, but actually to turn this around and perhaps backfill what hasn't been spent over the last 2 decades is going to require a lot more than 2.5%. How's that going to happen? What needs to happen to properly build back our forces and make it into a proper, let's say, deterrent force? And what kind of conversations do our leaders have to have with electorates? Because this is going to be painful for a lot of people.
Well, you're right, and there are a number of things here. General Rollo Walker said yesterday we've got 3 years basically, and the sort of force he's talking about, actually, we need a lot more than 2.5% to create that force. So that is a key element there. I think also you're right. The British public defence, and we saw it from the election, is not their number one concern. And I think it is a shame, because actually, if we get defence wrong, all the things that are vexing people at the moment, like the cost of living crisis, the NHS, pay rises, etc., could be horrifically irrelevant. Because, as Rollo Walker suggests, is that there is a chain of events which would have us fighting the Russians in Europe in 3 years' time. So, on that basis, we sort of need to, writing a piece of the Telegraph at the moment on this, we need to do all we can to deter Russia rather than give them excuse to crack on. And when it looks at, I think we look at capability, we currently have a military that is not configured for the war that we're looking at in Ukraine and probably the future war. Yeah, I spent 25 years in the army, ostensibly in Afghanistan and Iraq fighting terrorists. And, we're pretty good at that. But actually, that is not our main threat at the moment. It's more conventional, dare I say it, state on state that we're seeing in Ukraine. And it's changed slightly. Air defense is a key asset, which was never a huge concern in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, even in the First and Second Gulf Wars. And the development of the drones, which I'm sure you've covered on the podcast ad nauseum, but it is hugely significant and requires a different type of capability. Now, what the Chief of General Staff is talking about is being more lethal with what you've got, which is all very good. And there is this sort of speak or Whitehall speak about technology doing everything and saving everything. I'm sure people who studied the Second World War will realize actually it was a Nazis' reliance on technology that eventually undid them. It was the Allies' mass that prevailed. And I'm not sure. I'm not saying we need mass in the way that we did in the Second World War, but when we have an army of 70,000 people, and potentially we might be up against the Russians. Now we won't be alone, but the Russians have guess on around 500,000 soldiers in Russia at the moment, and one of the Russian generals only said yesterday they wanted to increase that by a couple of 100,000. So it is, when we look at what sort of military we need in future, of course we need to embrace all that technology, all the way that drones are used and air defense and everything else. But at the moment we are way off that, and that's why our conventional deterrence has failed. I think also when it comes to air power, I'm pretty disappointed that the new defense secretary has not confirmed Tempest, the new RAF fighter jet, which it sounds a bit strange coming from a soldier that we need more air power, but the reason Ukraine has suffered so much is because Russia has had air superiority most of this war. Now that might start changing. Now, and again, you wouldn't be surprised as a soldier saying, why on earth we have two massive aircraft carriers to patrol the South China Seas, when to me, and having been with the Australian Army for a few years, I know that to me that is their theatre of operations. And I think we need to, with our NATO allies and allies like the Australians and AUKUS, we need to focus on where we are best placed to provide defence of this country and defence of NATO. And I personally believe it is in the European theatre, and that will be a focus on land, on air power. And we need to have sufficient maritime power to protect these islands, not necessarily project power to the South China Sea. So an awful lot for the Strategic Defence Review to do, but it's not going to drop for about 12 months. And if you believe Chief of the General Staff, a year or so after that, we could be fighting. So I think we need to get on with it, and the government needs to be prepared to spend a lot more money to make sure that we try and draw back the great peace dividend that we have so overspent.
And they may need to perhaps prioritize or drop some of those early recommendations before the full-scale report, I would imagine. Otherwise, I don't know quite how this works, but the recruitment, the training, the scaling up of military forces, plus commissioning the equipment they may need, whether it's artillery units and so on, these are all very, very long, drawn-out processes, aren't they, even at the best of times?
Well, absolutely. And you raise a really good point there on the training. The reason the Russians are suffering at the moment and virtually able to do nothing except, give a soldier a gun and tell him to march towards the enemy is because they can't train. In order to do combined arms warfare with tanks and infantry and air defense, it takes a lot of training. When I was commanding officer of the 1st Royal Tank Regiment, we trained for a year to 18 months before we were combat ready. The average Russian tank crew is getting about 4 weeks. the average Russian infantryman is getting about 2 weeks training. So when we look at what we're doing in future, that's got to be factored in. And one of the issues that the army in particular are having, and recruitment and retention is a big issue, is a lot of money, a lot of savings have been taken out of training now, which is absolutely crass. It's all very well having this flashy technology, but unless you've got people who can train with it and train with all the other capabilities and assets, you're not going to realize its benefits. And that seems to be something when people they see big flashy items of kit, we'll have that, but if you don't invest in the training and support and development, then you might as well not have it. So it's very important that the Defence Review recognises that and gets on and trains it, because I think at the moment, we are probably a bit like the Russian army. We can probably shoot straight, but doing much more than that, apart from in the Special Forces community, is going to be a challenge.
Now, you will have experienced how the whole Whitehall procurement process works and how these sort of defence reviews play out. What seems to be happening in Ukraine, and as you mentioned, drone warfare, and I won't talk about the individual tactics or the technology of it, but what is really interesting is the conjunction between tech entrepreneurialism, which tends to move fast, break things, get stuff done, plus what's happening on the front. And then there's this sort of grease in the machine, which is civic society. And there's this extraordinary, rapid evolution of technology, tactics, and training that is facilitated by this direct communication, almost real time, between the entrepreneurs and the manufacturers and what's happening at the front, and then the transmission of data and learnings back. This kind of rapid iteration process, plus the evolution of electronic warfare that goes hand in hand with it, this surely is going to be an immense challenge for Whitehall and its sluggish processes, and let's be frank, sometimes the fairly wrong-headed and inefficient procurement processes that can take place.
Well, absolutely, and as many people say in this area, perfection is the enemy of the good. And I use one example of recently announced by the Ministry of Defence are laser weapons that can be put on tanks or on ships to shoot down these drones, which, in my experience, when I was the Peshmerga's chemical weapons advisor for a 2-year fight with ISIS back in the sort of 2015, 2017, where ISIS were dropping hand grenades on us from drones. The only thing we had was small arms, so I had to shoot them down. And actually, it was pretty difficult. We then jumped forward to Ukraine, where we've got millions, thousands of drones flying around. The initial chagrin of many was that we were using missiles that cost thousands and thousands of pounds to shoot down these, 500-pound drones sort of things. So to hear that actually Defence Science Lab at Portsdown have developed this capability to shoot down loads of drones with lasers at very low cost is great. But those of us who are experienced with military procurement are now thinking, crikey, the Whitehall and the Abbey Wood machine again get involved. In about 10 years' time, we'll get this capability, which will be redundant. So, yeah, if the new government, and they do have some innovative ideas, and, the chap who's now involved in prisons coming from the private sector, if they can get more agile with defence procurement by, as you say, using entrepreneurs and others to get it moving forward, then so be it. There is this, it's completely counter the sort of risk aversion that we have with the military and capability. We're quite happy to give young men and women a rifle and tell them to charge the enemy, but we're then not happy to develop some new kit to get it onto the front line in case there are a few glitches with it. So to me, if we could get those lasers to the front line in Ukraine tomorrow, then they'll be really useful, and they might not work perfectly, but so what? But I bet they will in 6 to 12 months' time, because continuing combat, your technology and your techniques and procedures evolve much more quickly than you do sat back here in Wiltshire, thinking how it's best to work. So if we can do that, then we can make an advantage and really move forward. But let's see. I mean, we need to accelerate that. Otherwise, we are not going to be in a position to deter the Russians in the next couple of years.
And of course, it would be an extraordinary visual expression of our support for Ukraine. Just seeing a couple of pictures that have come out of the testing of something like Dragonfire, visually, it would be an absolutely extraordinary thing. Let's turn to your area of expertise, because you've talked about the incredible brutality unleashed on the Syrian people, but also the Russian strategy there of essentially annihilating the civilian population, their infrastructure, into submission. We see attempts to do that in Ukraine. Without Western supplied air defense systems, they would have likely achieved something like that. And those areas like Bakhmut, Soledar, and others, which weren't protected with air defense, have been turned into ash and rubble. Will Russia continue doing this? And in fact, will it escalate into areas like chemical warfare? Or is there evidence they're already doing that?
Well, there is absolutely evidence on the chemical warfare side, which I'll come back to. But on your piece about attacking civilians, again, with my experience in Syria, I don't think they'll stop at all. And, each time they hit a hospital, it was, some mistake, or it was actually an air defense weapon. But we know that is ridiculous. And, we know that they are directly targeting it, because it worked in Syria. And I saw Aleppo in 2016, where 400,000 civilians basically capitulated after they were bombed and bombed and bombed and bombed. And eventually, actually, the thing that broke the camel's back was the Syrian regime dropping lots of chlorine on them. And when we go onto the chemical weapons side, I've done a study with a chap called Jimmy Rushton, who's a freelancer, works for the Telegraph and also Reuters, of the use of chemical weapons on the front line, which the Russians are doing on an industrial scale. But it's hardly news. I mean, it is unbelievable. And the reason that they're doing it is quite simply, I mean, it's good tactics, actually, because we know the Ukrainian forces don't have gas masks, or if they do have gas masks, they have old Russian ones, which don't work. And what the Russians are doing is they're dropping chloropicrin and other riot control agents from drones into trenches. And what this does is, if, although a riot control agent is only effective, it's an incapacitant rather than a killer, but for 5 or 6 minutes. But what the Russian tactic is to drop the chloropicrin into trenches. That means the soldiers then get out of the trench, because it's pretty unpleasant stuff, and the Russians then attack them conventionally. And this is the only way the Russians have made progress on the front lines. And it's, I say, an industrial scale, because the Ukrainian government produced a report to the UN and the Organization of Prohibition of Chemicals only 2 weeks ago, detailing 3,200 uses of CW in the war and 600 in the last 4 weeks. I spoke to a commander on the front, I won't say where they are, the other day, and he said it's morning and night. And there's a bit of a horseshoe now. I'm actually trying to work on a program to get them some gas masks, and I've got a few going, but it's a simple thing. So basically, your point, yeah, if you have no morals or scruples, you would attack civilians and you'd use chemical weapons all the time. And the Russians saw how successful it was in Syria. Assad is still in power because he used chemical weapons. He wouldn't be if he hadn't. And Putin has no morals or scruples. And at the moment, we are doing nothing. There is no Obama red line that is being used in this particular area. Everybody's fixated by Putin's nuclear threats. But I have written and spoken on many podcasts that I believe these are completely hollow, because the nuclear deterrent that we have in this country is absolutely right for purpose. And Putin knows that the West's nuclear capability is as good, if not stronger than his, and he doesn't want to be annihilated. His tactical nuclear weapons, he needs to get them on the border of Ukraine to make them effective because of their range. And hopefully Putin realizes, and the Ukraine government have been given permission that if those launchers are put close to their border, they can be taken out by precision weapons. So, a bit of a rambled answer to your question, but yeah, unfortunately, Putin is not like what we would consider to be a rational and moral leader. He is a tyrant, and he will do whatever he can to succeed, and we need to be aware of that.
And it's extraordinary, isn't it, that we limit the scope of our actions because of what he may or may not do, while ignoring what he actually has done and continues to do. So you've listed the chemical weapons, you've listed the attacks against civilian targets, including the abominable attack on a children's cancer hospital. But there are many, many other examples of these things. But if we also look at what is unfolding on the territory of Europe, the sabotage of facilities, including munitions and defense facilities, the apparently thwarted assassination attempt on the CEO of Rheinmetall, cyber attacks, which are demonstrably inflicted by Russia, including the one on the NHS. All these things are likely to scale up significantly. Why are we not taking action to really tackle the source of these, which is Putin and his regime, and which a victory in Ukraine would probably not end, but actually dramatically exacerbate or make worse these kind of hybrid aggressions?
Well, I concur with everything you said, and I'm talking to you today from Salisbury, where, of course, Putin conducted a chemical weapons attack, on our town, and killed one innocent civilian. So I think it's again getting people to really realize what is going on, and there are so many other distractions, and it seems crass to say so. I think those of us, you and I and others who look at these things closely, are really concerned and trying to highlight that to the general population. But actually, a lot of people are looking down and not looking outwards, and not really realizing the potential threats. And I think the confusion, for want of a better word, of the recent election, people are, those politicians who want to be elected have highlighted issues that they know that people are going to vote for, like pay rises and stopping the cost of living crisis, stopping immigrants, and all the rest of it, rather than actually something that could have a profound effect on this country, is war with the Russians. And as you say, that we are already, the Russians are absolutely attacking us where they can, be it in cyberspace or elsewhere. And if they get a foothold in Ukraine, then not only will those threats increase, but also the requirement for us to get our own boots on the ground to stop them. Because I think we really need to get the Baltic countries to shout louder. There is no need to convince people in Latvia and Lithuania what's going on, and the fact that their call to arms, the fact that 1 million Finns have a rifle in their back shed ready to go and fight. It's a very different attitude in this country now. Not that we want to mobilize the whole of Britain and in some sort of home guard, but we just need to make people aware. Actually, if we get this wrong in Ukraine, all the rest of it, the stuff that people are worrying about, could become horrifically irrelevant.
I was actually thinking that along those lines, and that probably we should be forming battalions of racing drone experts and military drone experts in every county. That's maybe something that we can think about. The very, very last question here, and it may well be a short one because I know time is pressing. It seems that the outcome of this war is accelerating, but is still uncertain, and it will depend on energy, human energy, the positive energy that Ukrainians have for their survival, and that energy is being tested at the moment by the drip feed of weaponry. You've got the energy behind the ordnance and munitions supplied. You've got economic energy, and fundamentally you've got fuel energy. Now, both the Russians and the Ukrainians seem to understand this acutely, that if you can attrit the energy of the other side, you will potentially overwhelm them. This equation does not perhaps seem to land quite so well on the Allies, who are very queasy and nervous about Ukraine hitting Russian energy infrastructure and are not blocking Russia's Grace Fleet in the Baltics, closing the Crimean Sea to Russia's sort of rust buckets that potential cause an environmental disaster. Do we need to get serious about closing off the sources of energy and power to the Russian war machine?
I think we do, absolutely, and you really highlight the key point that people don't understand it or don't want to look up and see what the requirement is here. Absolutely needs to be strangled. I mean, I think the sort of moral energy is a wrong word to use for the Russians, but actually, the casualties they've taken, 600,000 dead. A country of that size cannot sustain that ad infinitum. And the next type of recruits the Russians have got to go for are those who live in the leafy suburbs of St. Petersburg and Moscow. And once they start dying in great numbers, the people who Putin relies on and the people he's made rich, could well be of his demise. But more importantly, I think what you're saying about attacking the lifeblood that is keeping the Russian army going and the Russian forces going is what we should be focused on. And it is much better that we see the defeat of Russia and rather the prevailing of Ukraine, because if we don't, we only have to look back to the last World War to see what that meant and to see our involvement. And by doing taking risk, which is something that politicians hate to do now, could prevent much greater risk in future. So I hope that the American election in November is a rallying call to the rest of Europe and NATO and the UK to do everything we can to enable Ukraine to prevail. And absolutely, as you say, cut the lifeblood, cut the head off the snake, be it the power snake or be it their military that is waltzing around the world. Because if we don't, this threat could be with us for generations.
Hamish, it's a huge pleasure to have you on the channel and to discuss these issues based on your extraordinary in-depth experience. Thanks so much. I hope to repeat the pleasure at some point. A lot is happening, so I'm sure there'll be no shortage of things to talk about. But for now, thank you so much.
Thanks very much for having me, Jonathan. Pleasure.